Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I would have come in person if it hadn't been an election day. But
We were first, I'll have you know.
yeah, it's true. Uh, I don't know why the government did not know that. My talk tonight is going to be about a comparison between the New Brunswick flora and the Nova Scotia flora, with a focus on species that are unique to one province or the other. So how different is your neighbor? Your New Brunswick neighbor. We're right beside each other, but we do have some differences. A lot of the plants are the same, but these are some examples of differences just in my title slide here. I'll give a quick look at those. The round-leaved greenbrier and the inkberry on the top left corner are both unique to Nova Scotia within Canada in those cases. They're southern species of the Atlantic coastal plain that are found in southern Nova Scotia. Then the other species that you see there are unique in New Brunswick within the Maritimes, but they occur elsewhere in Canada. Here are some statistics about the two floras of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. New Brunswick has 1,783 species, slightly higher total overall than Nova Scotia. And when you compare the native and exotic species, New Brunswick's native species total is a good little bit higher, and the exotic species total is less. And there's a few species that we aren't really sure if they're exotic or not exotic. Nova Scotia has a few more of those, 34 more of those. So we'll go into the reasons for the differences, but we'll do a little bit more statistical analysis. And I'll tell you, I picked one plant that's a representative of only in New Brunswick and only in Nova Scotia here. This stout goldenrod I picked because it might be something that people in Nova Scotia could find. It occurs reasonably close to the border in Albert County, New Brunswick. It occurs usually along rivers, on banks, open banks. It can also occur on roadside forest edges. So can you see those little curved bracts underneath the flowers on the stout goldenrod? That's the thing that's quite distinctive about it. It's a big goldenrod. It stands straight upright. It doesn't bend over in the flower head like some other goldenrods. So you can watch for that one. It might turn up in Nova Scotia someday. Now, looking at some of the, before we get into the native species, which we're mostly going to concentrate on, why would Nova Scotia have more exotic species than New Brunswick? There's a few different reasons for that. There are more people in Nova Scotia. There are more ports in Nova Scotia, which is one of the ports of entry for plants. Nova Scotia has a milder climate overall with an oceanic influence and moderated winters, and that gives a lot more potential species in the species pool of plants that might colonize. And there's more horticultural introductions in Nova Scotia overall, and more early botanical work with Rowland and Smith, who produced the first Nova Scotia floras. The thing about exotic plants is that they get listed, and not all of them stick around in Nova Scotia or in whatever province, but they never come off the list, basically. So the longer that there's been botanical work, the more exotic species you're going to have. So those are some of the factors that result in there being a bit more of exotic species in Nova Scotia. These are some examples of horticultural species that are only found in Nova Scotia so far. This fig-root buttercup is something that's a spring ephemeral plant. It's quite invasive, but produces a fairly spectacular floral display. And there's a place just outside of Wolfville where it's overrunning a little stream bed right beside the highway. Something you could watch for if you're in that area. European black alder is another thing that has been introduced by horticulture into very locally in Nova Scotia. Not yet found in New Brunswick. Another thing I mentioned, there were more of those undetermined species. One of the reasons for that is that there are more species. There's this large pool of species in New Brunswick that have come into Nova Scotia and maybe have come in with European colonization effects. Things like milkweed may not be native in Nova Scotia, and the tall beggar's ticks. Those are examples of things where we have them classed as unknown native. We don't know if they're native or exotic. So Nova Scotia has some more of those than New Brunswick. Now, when we look at the whole pool of species, we've got just over 1,200 native species, and most of them are in both provinces. 1,006 of them are in both provinces. And then there are those little slivers on each side of the Venn diagram there that are only found in one or the other. New Brunswick has 162 unique for the maritime species, or unique for New Brunswick plus Nova Scotia species, and Nova Scotia has 110 of those. Two more examples that you see there. Another coastal plain flora, that netted chain fern for Nova Scotia, and the tall cinquefoil or tall wood beauty. Oh, I didn't change the scientific name there. Sorry about that. That is now called Drymocallis arguta. Used to be a potentilla cinquefoil.
Mm. Oh.
Whoops, sorry about that. All right, so what drives the differences between the two provinces? In New Brunswick, it's much more connected to the rest of North America. We often hear about the Chignecto Isthmus near where I'm at in Sackville. It's that little narrow connection that could get largely flooded in a huge storm and lock Nova Scotia away from everyone else. That's important for plants as well, because 20,000 years ago on towards 12,000 years ago, the whole area was covered in ice. The plants were gone, and everything had to recolonize after the glacial ice receded. And for things that have habitats that aren't represented in that isthmus region, it would have been kind of hard into Nova Scotia. So more things have been able to colonize in New Brunswick. Another thing about New Brunswick is that the river systems are much larger, especially the St. John River system, which you see there going up the west side of New Brunswick, and it extends way beyond in through Maine and off into Quebec even. So the drainage basin for the St. John River is almost exactly the same size as the entire province of Nova Scotia, 55,000 plus square kilometers.
Wow.
And so it's a magnificent big river. The habitats along it are things that you just don't find in Nova Scotia as a result. The largest river in Nova Scotia is the St. Mary's River, which you see there in the northeast corner of the mainland, and you can see there's a dozen or more rivers in New Brunswick that are as big as that. So all the river associated habitats are better represented in New Brunswick and offer more potential habitats for special species. New Brunswick also has a lot more limestone than Nova Scotia overall. Large portions of the west and the north are underlain by limestone, and there's a lot of species that rely on the more basic soils that result from limestone bedrock. And the climate is different somewhat in New Brunswick in that there's cold, more continental winters that aren't so moderated by the ocean when you get away from the coast. On the Nova Scotia side, we have a province that has most of its area strongly moderated in the winter, so cool, but not super cold winters. And in the southern part of the province, especially, quite warm winters and a warm overall climate. And a strong element of the Atlantic coastal plain flora from along the US East Coast that's colonized the southern tip of Nova Scotia and doesn't occur elsewhere. And interestingly, you've also got some of the more severe northern conditions in the two provinces up in Cape Breton in the highlands. The ocean effect there makes springs quite cold. It makes snow last quite long in the highland areas. And there's very, very severe winds that prevent trees from growing on large parts of the highlands, or a big contributing factor anyway in preventing trees from growing. All those things allow more Arctic plants to persist in Cape Breton than anywhere else in the region. A final little bit about Nova Scotia. We've got a small handful, 3 special species that are on Sable Island only. I'll mention those later on. So you've all heard about coastal plain flora before, I expect, but that's the element of the Nova Scotia flora that's mostly found south and west of Halifax, and it's species that have their main range along the US East Coast in the lowlands, and many of them are really special in Canada. So this is the most significant element of the unique to Nova Scotia species within our region. they can persist down in the south because of the mild conditions, and they're mostly acidic lakeshore species, bog species, and some salt marsh species. 52 species in this Atlantic coastal plain flora category among the unique Nova Scotia ones. 32 of those are found nowhere else in Canada. So that's a really special type of flora component. 15 of the species are federally listed as threatened, endangered, threatened, or special concern, and 2 additional provincially listed species. So you can see 4 of the federally listed species down along the bottom there. Pink coreopsis was mentioned as one of the targets at Wilson's Lake. The Plymouth gentian is another one that's on Wilson's Lake. Sweet pepperbush is at a small handful of locations, some near Kejimkujik and some down near the Wilson's Lake area. And golden crest is found in scattered bogs and lake shores in southwestern Nova Scotia. A few more Atlantic coastal plain species, just because I couldn't resist adding more pictures. These are mostly lakeshore species here. You can read the names. I'll mention the coastal plain pondweed, or coastal plain Joe Pye weed is an interesting one. It looks a lot like the common Joe Pye weed, the spotted Joe Pye weed that is everywhere, but it's a bit shorter. The leaves are shorter and broader, proportionately broader, and they tend to have a really strong lower vein going up the sort of the length of the leaf. So that's only found in the southernmost part of Nova Scotia, basically. So these are some lakeshore coastal plain flora. These are some salt marsh coastal plain flora, and the salt species are most prevalent in the very southern tip of Nova Scotia, down in the Tusket Bay region, Lobster Bay, Tusket region. Big leaf marsh elder. I understand there was some study of that sponsored by the Flora Society. The salt marsh agelinus is an interesting one. Most people who've been out looking at plants have probably noticed the other kinds of agelinus that are like this that occur in roadside ditches and disturbed ground. This one only occurs in salt marshes. And if you look at the calyx, the cup that's underneath the flower, those little tips are squared off. You can just see that in my picture there. That distinguishes it along with its salt marsh habitat. And then another of the shrubs in the aster family, both these, the marsh elder and the eastern baccharis, are shrubs that are in the aster family. They're the only woody members of the family that we have in eastern Canada. And very, very southern species that just make it into Nova Scotia. We have a few coastal plain upland species. These are some of the examples. They're in sand barren habitats and rock barren habitats. You've got the Canada rock rose or Canada frostweed. It occurs in the Annapolis Valley sand barrens and scattered other places. The pine barren golden heather, which is quite a dominant species in the Annapolis Valley sand barrens and in rock barrens in the south of Nova Scotia. And blue curls is a very rare species that's only known from one spot in the Shingle Lake area on a rock barren, which I was very happy to find many years back. Now, there are a good number of other southern species. I don't have the number here in front of me. It was something like eight or nine other southern species that occur in the coastal plain region of Nova Scotia, but they aren't really associated with the coastal plain when in their main range. This is one of the ones that is quite an interesting looking plant. It's called cancer root, Canophilus americana. It's a parasitic plant. It's got a fungal association with oak roots. It only occurs in association with red oak. It doesn't produce its own chlorophyll, its own food. It's attached to the roots of the oak. It steals its nutrients that way. It flowers. It's a flowering picture on the left and a fruiting picture on the right. And it's scattered in a few places around Kentville, in Kejimkujik National Park. That's the easiest place for most people to see it, I think. It's also at Bridgewater in one spot down near Yarmouth. But if you're in Kejimkujik, you can see this plant near the end of the public road in the Grafton Lake area. If you walk in the oak forest down there, there's quite a bit of it around. This is another example of a southern species that is sort of coastal plain-like, but its range is broader than the coastal plain. It's called the wavy-leaved aster. It looks a lot like many of our other asters, but it has really unique leaves that clasp at the clasp around the stem, and the lower leaves flare out near the stem, and then they narrow again, and they have a heart-shaped blade. And a little bit further up, they're sort of doing the same thing, but not quite as extensively. So this is a really special species in Canada. You see it along the roadsides as you're driving into Kejimkujik from Liverpool, and in that region, you'll see it. There's a few spots elsewhere on the Windsor gypsum, places where it occurs as well. Here's another southern species with a really disjunct in Nova Scotia. It's a strange one because it occurs in rich soils. Almost all the rich soil species are more prevalent in Brunswick than in Nova Scotia. But this is one that has not been found in New Brunswick at all yet. And this is something you can watch for very soon. It would be up now and almost ready to flower probably. It's a spring ephemeral. It's an annual plant, so it grows from seed every year, called false mermaid weed. There are places, I'm told, along the Annapolis River in the Cornwallis River, maybe it is, in the Annapolis Valley, that have quite a lot of this. It's known very locally in the Glendyre area around southern Cape Breton. It's one of the only dicot plants that has 3 petals. It's not a monocot. Most of the monocots, like trilliums and lilies, have 3 petals or 3 petals and 3 sepals that look similar, so 6. But this is a dicot with 3 petals, and it forms these kind of dense, tangly patches. And so that's one you can watch for. I'd be very interested to hear if anyone finds new spots for this. Another one that's associated with calcareous soils and somehow has managed to skip New Brunswick but to Nova Scotia is the ram's head leper. It's quite rare and quite threatened in Nova Scotia. It occurs almost exclusively on gypsum rock, mostly in the Windsor, plus one site at Angevine Lake, Cumberland County. So that's a pretty special Nova Scotia species, a very unusual distribution pattern. Now, the other major pattern or major group within these unique to Nova Scotia species is the northern species, Arctic and high boreal subarctic plants. There's 35 of those in Nova Scotia that don't occur in New Brunswick. They're mostly in the Cape Breton highlands, and some of them are also in some coastal barrens along the Atlantic side of Nova Scotia. They're here in Nova Scotia because Nova Scotia has pretty extensive unforested habitat. After glaciation, the areas that became forest became unsuitable for Arctic and subarctic plants, but with unforested barrens and cliffs, they can persist locally. And Nova Scotia has those cool ocean moderated conditions that help with the persistence. So you can see some examples here. The pink crowberry of rock barrens, the marsh lousewort, which is a wet coastal meadow kind of plant, only known from one look in Nova Scotia right now. And I think Bob is the only one who's found that perhaps in Nova Scotia.
Saw it too.
And yeah, so that was a nice find. And the small flowered grass of Parnassus is another sort of wet meadow plant of the north. Some of these plants that occur in Nova Scotia but not New Brunswick are true Arctic tundra plants. These are 4 examples, really attractive and exciting, very different sort of plants, very prostrate to the ground, growing in very harsh conditions. These 4 species you'll find in super exposed, very rocky, harsh spots on cliffs, sort of cliff rims and cliff ledges. One of the bearberry willow there, it doesn't even look like a willow as we tend to know them, tall shrubs and small trees. But these are plants that occur very broadly in the Arctic, often both Old World and New World, but are just managing to hold on in more harsh conditions here in Nova Scotia. We also have some plants that are able, some of the Arctic plants that are able to hold on in deep, cold ravines, where they're kind of, it's probably the lack of summer warmth that allows them to persist in these spots. These are some examples that I found, or they'd already been found in this location, but we relocated the location on Big Southwest Brook in Cape Breton Highlands National Park. The mountain sorrel, this is the only location in the Maritimes for the plant. The picture on the left is at Big Southwest Brook, and I threw this picture on the right in. It's from the Yukon. It's sort of a more typical growth form. It shows how it's persisting in a place that's not really probably its perfect spot. It's too shaded down deep in the ravine, but it is very cool down in there. Same with the mountain saxifrage. I've got the picture on the top, which is from Big Southwest Brook, and the picture on the bottom is from the in Gros Morne, which are a standard place for it to occur. And same with this different deep up at Pollett's Cove Brook, the waterfall, this purple mountain saxifrage. The flowering picture is one just from the internet. So this is the floral emblem of Nunavut. It's another true Arctic plant, but managing to persist in a non-Arctic spot there in Pollett's Cove Brook. So that's it for the Arctic and northern plants there. We'll take a trip out to Sable Island. I was fortunate enough to get out to Sable Island this past summer to do some work monitoring the freshwater ponds there for Parks Canada. The ponds are subject to change, potentially very rapid change, if the fords get eroded away. One of the ponds that we started monitoring in 2015 is gone. It's not a pond anymore. It's just out on the beach. It's bare sand. So change is happening. The horses are a big factor as well in what vegetation is present. So I'll tell you about the three special species that are on Sable Island. They aren't especially beautiful species, but they are interesting ones. It's called chaffweed. You can see its range there in North America. It's really sparsely scattered over much of the United States. Yellow means that it's rare in the sort of pale bluish green up in New York and Massachusetts means that it's considered introduced up there. And the green means that it's considered native. It also occurs in Europe. So this plant is actually these freshwater ponds growing around the margins in the muddy zone. And maybe it's native. Maybe it managed to get over from Europe or from some other part of Nova Scotia into Sable Island. It's very curious how it would ever have been introduced there naturally or by people, because it's not found anywhere else in Nova Scotia except for one place that I happened to notice it at the roadside in Kedjikujik National Park. So curious plant. We consider it native on a sort of precautionary principle. And so we consider it a concern in Sable Island. Similar situation with this one. This one is definitely a European species. It's not native anywhere else in North America. Well, I guess it's potentially native in Newfoundland, St. Pierre and Miquelon, and Sable Island. Again, it's on every pond in Sable Island. It's called bulb rush or bulb bearing rush because look in the flower heads there. That is actually a flower that's open, the white bit, and then those are seed pods. And there's little leafy bits coming out of seed pods. Those are bulbs, can reproduce into new plants. This sort of a vegetative propagule, and so it's an interesting little rush. And again, we're treating as potentially native, way out there, 180 kilometers offshore on Sable Island. And similar to this one, this is a pondweed. Doesn't look a lot different from several of our weeds, but it is actually a different species that's in Europe, potentially native in Newfoundland, St. Pierre, Miquelon, and Sable Island. And it's quite common in the ponds. The name for it is cinnamon spot pondweed, brown spots along the base of the stem there. That's one of its different features. So that's a brief trip out to Sable Island. We'll go on to New Brunswick now. I got to keep going. I got lots of pictures to show you. We'll start off with the tree because the forests are kind of what makes the habitat over most of New Brunswick. And we have a few trees in New Brunswick that don't occur as native trees in Nova Scotia. These are the 4 of them. We've got basswood and butternut, which occur in upland forests and in swampy forests. Butternut is an endangered species in Canada because of introduced fungal disease. It's greatly declining. And then I've got bur oak, which occurs in New Brunswick really only in the floodplain of the St. John River, the lower St. John River around Grand Lake, Fredericton area. And we got black willow, another floodplain tree. It can grow to be a fairly sizable tree, but most of the time when you see it in New Brunswick, it's quite a smallish shrub, not often big tree size. The thing that's distinct about this black willow, if you're ever along the St. John River looking for it, it's got very long, skinny leaves with very elongated tips, and it's got big stipules, those leafy bits that wrap around the stem at the base of the leaf. So we'll go into the rich upland for hardwood forests of New Brunswick. That's one of the most exciting habitats for botanists. It's what people get really excited about at this time of year with the spring ephemerals. And the New Brunswick rich upland forest is quite a bit richer than in Nova Scotia overall. We've got 27 species in this habitat type that don't occur in Nova Scotia. And it's a really threatened, a lot of these are very rare species in New Brunswick. The habitat is the best place for agriculture, so a lot of it has been converted to potato fields. Forestry is an ongoing issue everywhere, and there's other development in the region as well. The area of occurrence is outlined there in red. It's in the St. John River Valley and over towards the Woodstock area up towards Perth Andover. That area is underlain mostly by limestone, and that's where you get a lot of these super rare species. I've listed them all there. You can have a chance to scan through and see the full list, but I'll show pictures of some of the nicest looking ones. That orchid, the showy orchis, is a super rare plant in New Brunswick. There's only maybe about 5 extant locations for that in New Brunswick. Beautiful plant, quite hard to notice because the leaves look a lot like a Clintoni or something when you don't see, if the flowers are not showing. And it's only in the richest limestone forests where you've got sort of continuous moderate moisture, not too dry, but not soaking either. Another plant of that habitat that's slightly more, probably about 20 occurrences known in Brunswick, is the lopseed, Phryma leptostachya. That has its own family. It's been classed in different families over the years, but I think now it's considered the only member of its family, the Phrymaceae. Was recently rediscovered in Maine for the first time in 100 years, just across the border from New Brunswick. So the Maine people were quite excited about that. Here's two species of the rich hardwood forest that are closely related to plants that you might be familiar with. We've got the sharp-lobed hepatica on the left and the squirrel corn on the right. Just found both in the last about 6-7 years in single locations in New Brunswick. Special rich hardwood plants, and the sharp-lobed hepatica has pointier leaves. That's the main difference from the round-lobed hepatica, which is the one that occurs in Nova Scotia. And the squirrel corn, you can compare it to Dutchman's breeches, one of our common rich hardwood forest plants. That's what I've on the left. The flower shape is similar but different, with more elongated stars on the Dutchman's breeches. The leaves are virtually identical. The squirrel corn aspect is because of the bulbs that occur around the roots being yellow on squirrel corn and pink on Dutchman's breeches. There are a few species of richer forest plants in the special category that like drier forests that might have more oak in them, that dry out or they get more light, and they might also occur up on the banks where it's sort of transitioning between the river and the forest. These are two examples. We've got barren strawberry, used to be called Waldsteinia fragarioides, but it's now considered a geum fragarioides, the yellow plant. Seneca snakeroot, a neat plant that is strongly sought after for medicinal uses. And two more species in this story that are restricted to the southwestern part of New Brunswick. Wood betony, the yellow flowered one that's on the right there. My picture is in seed, and then I added a picture from the internet with the yellow flowers. And maple leaf viburnum, very rare in New Brunswick, just makes it across the border at the St. Croix River, but very common as you get a little bit further west and south. So moving out of the rich forest to another important rare plant in New Brunswick that's quite different from Nova Scotia because of our larger rivers, the calcareous shoreline. The picture that I'm showing there is a limestone section of the Restigouche River. I would highly recommend the Restigouche River if you like doing and you like plants. It's a beautiful river to paddle on, and there's good transport facilities, people who will take you back to the start after you're done your trip. And the river is just carpeted with rare plants. But the shoreline meadows where there's seepage water coming down, and they get scoured by ice in the spring, and cliffs along the side in places that offer other types of habitats for rare plants. Big open gravel bars. The Restigouche River has the best examples of this type of habitat, but the St. John River has good examples as well. Historically, it would have had fantastic examples, but you can see in my drawings there, the red zones on the St. John have a lot of gaps. Those are where dams have flooded portions of the St. John River and eliminated all the interesting flora. And so there's the Mactaquac Dam, the Beechwood Dam, and the Grand Falls Dam, which have cut out about half the distance of natural habitat on the river. And the river is very disturbed by people, so it's quite weedy and invaded by exotics, which also affects some of the plants. But you find most of the species that were there historically. They're just not in quite as nice a context as the Restigouche. And some of these, there's examples of these calcareous river plants in parts of the Miramichi system that you see there in central New Brunswick. There's a narrow band of calcareous bedrock that extends up from the Fredericton region up through the Nashwauk, the Oxus and Miramichi, southwest Miramichi, and Renouse, Dungarvan, it's a little southwest Miramichi, all that way like that. So there's little bands, not quite as well developed as you see on the Restigouche. This is a picture of the Meduxniquig River, a much smaller river that flows into the St. John at Woodstock, but it's one of the very most exciting places for rare plants in New Brunswick. It's all limestone, and the valley is in much better condition than most of the other river valleys along the St. John. It wasn't heavily farmed right down into the valley as most of them were. And a lot of it is now in conservation hands with Sniquig River Conservancy. I forget what exact, Duxniquig River Association. I mentioned big open gravel bars. That's a habitat that has a few specialist species. This is one that it's not, we don't consider it rare in New Brunswick. There's quite a lot of it on some of our major rivers. It's sand cherry, but you don't see that at all in Nova Scotia. Neat little prostrate shrub that grows in that zone that gets extremely scoured every year by floodwaters. And here's some more of the beach plants, beach and shoreline outcrop plants that you'll find on these calcareous rivers. We've got Huron tansy there with a more dissected leaf than our really common European tansy, and larger flower heads, larger and fewer flower heads. The alpine, then the other three are members of the pea family. We don't have a lot of native pea species in Nova Scotia. They're quite hard. The ones that we do have are quite hard to find. They're rare. But on these calcareous rivers, these plants, although they're rare provincially, they're fairly common, especially the alpine hedysarn. Miles and miles of this along the Restigouche River, with these neat loments, or sort of pea pods that are flattened into little segments that break apart. Alpine milk vetch on the bottom, and St. John River local weed, that one actually does occur in Nova Scotia very locally. And this is another one that is in Nova Scotia. I think this is one of the most sought after plants in Nova Scotia. It's a butterwort, which is an insectivorous plant. You can see a lot of insects stuck in the sticky butter-like leaves, the upper surface of the leaves. This is a picture from the Restigouche River. There's about a 15-kilometer stretch of the Restigouche River where butterwort is fairly common, and very easy to see. You can just basically step out of the car and see it if you know where to look. Beautiful purple flowers there, related to the bladderworts. And so that was one of the plants of a calcareous seep. You can see groundwater flowing out of the slope and then down this river shore rock outcrop. Here are some other of the seepage specialists that you'll find in these calcareous rivers. The marsh grass of Parnassus is one that's quite common in that habitat. The northeastern paintbrush is sparser, but sort of fairly widespread through New Brunswick in those special habitats. The same with the lance-leaved arnica. All very nice, special seepage river shore plants. This is a type of habitat, the freshwater tidal rivers, that is found in Nova Scotia, but in New Brunswick, it's better represented because we have these bigger rivers and we have long zones of tides along the Northumberland Strait. The gradient of the land is not very extreme in that region. So there's long zones where the tide pushes in, and the Miramichi River is where it's best represented. You've got the tides that come in from Miramichi Bay up the river about 30 plus kilometers, right up to Red Bank and Sunny Corner. So you get these special habitats that are muddy, freshwater, and inundated a couple of times a day. And there are a few really unique species in those habitats. I'd highly recommend them as botanizing habitats. It's not just the species that I'll mention. There's a bunch of other ones beyond the ones that I'll show you. Here's an example of a little bit more of a marshy zone right near the head of tidal influence. The previous one is a bit downstream where it's a bit less heavily vegetated. And here's three of the special plants of that habitat. On the right there in that silky moist mud is the spongy head. That's one that I could imagine being found in Nova Scotia along the River Phillip. I have looked all along the River Phillip and have not seen it, but it's only about 100 kilometers from the River Phillip up in the Bass River estuary, Bass River Rishabukto River estuary. The middle plant is the annual salt marsh aster. It's known as close as the Cape Germain area at the bridge to Prince Edward Island. So it could also turn up in Nova Scotia somewhere. And Parker's pipewort, also possible in Nova Scotia, I suppose. But there's a lot of Parker's pipewort over about 20 kilometers of the Miramichi River. But otherwise, it's very rare in Canada. It's only found in the St. Lawrence estuary and the Miramichi estuary. So it's a lot like the pipewort that you see all over the place in Nova Scotia's lakes, but it's shorter, and it's an annual plant rather than a perennial, and it has a bit more of a cup shape to the inflorescence rather than spread out and flat. On to another one of our special New Brunswick habitats, or sort of a pair of habitats that you tend to find together: the calcareous swamp and the open calcareous fen. Certainly there are calcareous fens in Nova Scotia, a lot of them in southern Cape Breton, and some of them on the mainland of Nova Scotia. But New Brunswick limestone has probably more and more extensive examples of that type of habitat. And cedar, of course, is not very common in Nova Scotia, whereas in New Brunswick, it's quite a prevalent species over much of the province, and it's a dominant species in the calcareous forests of a lot of regions of New Brunswick. So there are quite a lot of interesting plants that you find in the cedar swamps. Here are a couple of the special New Brunswick cedar swamp plants. Swamp valerian. You can see its resemblance to the common or garden valerian that's weedy and spreading everywhere around human settlement these days. But this is a native plant that is in the openings in cedar swamps and the edges ends. It's much smaller and not as leafy. And then there's this special buttercup, the Lapland buttercup, that occurs just as a kind of prostrate, almost shamrock-like plant on the forest floor in just a few cedar swamps in northern Brunswick. And on to the open fens. This looks a lot like the Drosera filiformis, the thread-leaved sundew that occurs down in southern Nova Scotia. But the thread-leaved sundew only occurs in acidic peatlands, and slender-leaved sundew only occurs in basic calcareous peatlands. And it's super rare in New Brunswick. There's only three or four spots where it occurs. And one of them is down in southwest New Brunswick near the village of Canterbury. That's where this picture was taken. And there's another spot up at Shea Lake near Plaster Rock. So it's like the other sundews in that it captures insects and eats them, uses their nitrogen as a protein source. And what else was I going to say about this? I had one other thing I was going to say. I can't recall. But there are a bunch of other sedges and less showy plants that are associated with the fens of New Brunswick that we don't have in Nova Scotia. But I left it at just the more showy plants for this section. On to the last group, almost the last group of plants. These are sort of southern associated wetland plants that make it into New Brunswick, mostly in the River Valley. The lower St. John Valley has a lot of big open wetlands in the floodplain. And some of the other river Brunswick, southwest New Brunswick, like the St. Croix and the Macadavic, also have some of these flora along their floodplains. The plant that you can see there is probably known to many of you. It's cardinal flower, often used in gardens. It's our only predominantly hummingbird pollinated flower in the Maritimes. Brilliant red flowers, and quite common on a few of our southwestern New Brunswick rivers. I've always thought that it really should occur in southern Nova Scotia as well. It's fairly tolerant of at least moderately acidic soils. Maybe the soils in Nova Scotia are just too acidic in the south, but it likes rocky shorelines along forested streams, which we do have quite a lot of in Nova Scotia. I'll give you just a small sampling of the 19 other southern wetland species that I identified, that I listed as only in New Brunswick, not in Nova Scotia. This is one of the more prevalent ones. It's called ditch stonecrop, Penthorum cedoides. Used to be considered to be part of the stonecrop family, but now it's in its own separate family, the Penthoraceae, the ditch stonecrop family. It occurs in the south of New Brunswick, as close to Nova Scotia as the upper Petitcodiac River to the west of Moncton. Usually in muddy, seasonally exposed shores. And here's two similar shrubs that are locally common in the very southwestern edge of New Brunswick: silky dogwood and nannyberry, especially on the St. Croix River. There's of both of these two species on the St. Croix, which forms the border with Maine. And they get a couple of watersheds further over into New Brunswick, but not very much. Both of these are used in horticulture, so you may see them in Nova Scotia. Nannyberry was planted at the Kejimkujik Park headquarters, and I did notice some seedlings coming up in the woods adjacent to the house. We have a few regional endemics in New Brunswick that don't occur in Nova Scotia. The most famous of these is Furbish's lousewort, named after Kate Furbish, a amateur botanist in the 1800s who discovered it in Maine. It's only on the St. John River. It's a really unique species. It's quite different from any related lousewort in the east. So it was really exceptional, and it's not doing well at all in New Brunswick, unfortunately. The floods of late seem to be too severe for it, in combination with with some invasive plants, and the wild populations have really plummeted. There is a strong effort to conserve it via ex situ growing and experimental replanting out and so on. So there's seeds saved and plants growing in safe places, but it does not look good for that plant in the wild. Plant that shares its general habitat, general location is Anticostiaster. That grows in Quebec and northern New Brunswick and just into adjacent Maine. But it's much more extensive in New Brunswick than the Furbish's lousewort. There's a lot of Anticostiaster on the Restigouche River, and quite a bit on the St. John River too. And another little aster, an annual species of aster, is called the Gulf of St. Lawrence aster. That's a sort of salt marsh, estuarine, brackish marsh species. And it's found in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, along the Gulf of St. Lawrence coast, and in the Magdalen Islands. That's its whole global range. So in New Brunswick, you'll see it on the Acadian Peninsula and down, well, basically only the Acadian Peninsula. It was historically at Cushbuguac, and it's been reintroduced there. Those populations, the reintroduced populations, are persisting so far. So final regional endemic for you is this one. I just wrote the Kosiwik status report update for this species, finished a couple of weeks ago. The Gulf of St. Lawrence beach pinweed. It's a subspecies that's only found on the coast of New Brunswick and the coast of northern Prince Edward Island. And the species itself is found along the U.S. coast from Maine down to North Carolina. But the plants in the Gulf of St. Lawrence are different enough that they have a separate name, variety subcylindrica, and they're quite threatened by coastal change as well. The Prince Edward Island populations that we've been looking at for 15 to 20 years, some of them a lot of the plants are gone. The whole beaches are gone. The dunes are gone, and they're beaches now. So sea level rise and increased storm intensity and so on is changing habitats, and it's affecting coastal species that need the more stabilized dune habitat that you see here, where it's developed into a shrubby shrubby matrix with some dune grass and lichens and beech heather and so on.
Beautiful.
I just have a few final favorites that don't fit as well in any particular category, but I did want to mention. There's one really special place in New Brunswick, not too far from the Nova Scotia border, near the village of Hillsborough, south of Moncton, near the Hopewell Rocks. There's a gypsum outcrop there, a big area of gypsum, some of which was mined and others which has been left in a actively eroding slopey area with some caves. And in the gypsum talus or scree, the fine gypsum rock that comes off these slopes, it's always eroding, and it can never get forested as a result. And this population of the entire leaf mountain avens, a very widespread Arctic species, has managed to persist there presumably since glaciation. So there's quite a bit of it. And there's a couple of other rare Arctic plants there, Solidago multiradiata, type of goldenrod, and Salix myrtillifolia, the myrtle-leaved willow. So really special spot that has a few special plants, and especially this one. And finally, this is just a grab bag of pretty plants that I couldn't leave out of a talk about plants that are special to New Brunswick and not in Nova Scotia. We've got fringed milkwort there, also called gaywings. It's a forest plant that occurs in kind of the, I would say, generic forest types. Mixed forest, can be in deciduous forest, can be in coniferous forest or mixed forest. It's fairly southern. It's just a plant that seems to have not very successfully colonized the Maritimes. It probably isn't a lack of suitable habitat. Maybe it's climate that has limited it to this point. It's only found in about 15 spots in the southwest New Brunswick mostly. We have in central New Brunswick, mostly in the Miramichi drainage basin, this quite attractive type of gentian, the narrow-leaved gentian, Gentiana linearis. Again, it's a shoreline plant of rivers and marsh edges and so on. The habitat is not that special. It doesn't require a special type of soil really, but it's just not that common in New Brunswick. It has never made it to Nova Scotia. And the early saxifrage over here is quite localized in New Brunswick to cliffy places along the edge of the St. John River. There's some that are in the upper St. John, the very upper northwest corner of New Brunswick, and there's some that are in the area near the Mactucac Dam. There are not many other locations for this plant in the Maritimes. It gets very common as you go further west into I know it from southern Ontario is a very common plant. That's where this picture was taken, actually. So I think that comes to my end. I didn't have time as I was putting all these pictures together to write up a conclusion statement, but I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I hope you've learned about how the floras differ between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Although most of the plants in the two provinces are the same, they're shared both. There are some significant differences between the two, and there's some notable patterns in those differences. And there are lots of interesting places to see in New Brunswick if you're a Nova Scotia botanist, and I certainly invite you to come across the border and experience. So with that, I'll leave the talk and go to questions. Thanks, everybody. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll put the chat open if okay. Dave Patrick has got a
Oh, this is a wonderful presentation, Sean. I just love the overview of both provinces. It's kind of just
thank you.
Just marvelous. I'm just wondering your thoughts about assisted migration and if we should be maybe actively doing more of it given climate change and everything, because obviously New Brunswick would be a place to get stuff for Nova Scotia. And are you involved in any discussions of that sort of thing? Just curious.
Mostly not. I mean, it's a topic that comes up now and again, or fairly often. Yeah. It's a complicated subject to get into. I'm not saying that there's no place for it. That's for sure. There's I think the things that are less have fewer issues to deal with would be things where it's already present in the general region, but maybe it's not
Yeah.
that common, and
Yeah.
maybe it's also threatened by land change, conversion to housing or whatever, moving things around on the small scale to keep them in the region doesn't seem likely to have a lot of negative effects, high potential for negative effects. Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated issue set of that I can't necessarily good response right away.
Yeah. Anyway, I think you'd be the person to ask. That's why I was.
Thank you.
Anyway, thanks.
Hi, Sean. I wonder,
Oh,
could
yes,
you say anything about the status of Calypso bulbosa in New Brunswick?
sure. Yes.
That's a plant I'd love
Um,
to see. I saw it in the
Calypso
Rockies a bunch.
bulbosa is, yeah, it's common enough in the Rockies, but so Calypso is a very attractive orchid. It has basically a single leaf, a single stem, a single flower, all pretty small, but well, except for the flower. The flower is fairly large for a single flower. Very pretty pink stripy flower, and it's a plant that just does not do well with forest disturbance. It was historically kind of all over the place in New Brunswick. It would never have been common, but it was around in old growth cedar swamps, sort of in the upland tussocks within cedar swamps. Probably was one of the best places to find. Also just in old spruce fir forest where the soil was a little bit richer. But it seems to be pretty gone everywhere. You hardly ever see it in Brunswick. There are a few places that people know that it still persists. Jim Goltz would be happy to show you his favorite spots to find it. Jim Goltz is a great botanist in Fredericton. I've only seen it once in the Maritimes. I saw it once up in Antinourie Lake, which is now a nature reserve outside of Bathurst. It doesn't it flowers quite early. So usually when I'm in the field in July, it's already done flowering. So it's hard as just a little leaf on the floor.
Good, thanks. I was curious.
Yeah, it has been reported in Nova Scotia. It was on a list for the part of the plants of Cape Breton Highlands, and it could, by habitat, occur in the Cape Breton Highlands. But there were a lot of kind of unlikely or otherwise unknown things on the same list. So I don't have it as a confirmed species for Nova Scotia.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Sean, is that the Drius integrifolia location.
Yeah.
I was there a few years back and noticed when I was photographing it that the scree that it's on is at a really curious angle to the sun, and that it doesn't the sun basically the sun just glances across the surface. At least this is when I was there at the end of May, and the leaves were completely illuminated by the sun, but the scree was not. And it made me think maybe that's why an Arctic plant could live there, is because the sun wasn't heating up the substrate.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's quite a special spot. There's a lot of gypsum scree in Nova Scotia, no dryas on that. So and presumably that plant would have been in Nova Scotia after glaciation. I would guess, but anyway, yeah, you would think there's something special about that place that allows the plant to persist there, and that's a good theory.
I don't know how you prove it, but yeah. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, and I think I'm sure we've been competing with the election results, and I think we've helped a pretty good audience here. I'm really impressed. So well done. So I'm gonna thank you so much. Like, you really opened my eyes to a lot of New Brunswick here, Sean. So I'm gonna have to do a little exploring, I think, based on some. I'm really glad this is recorded because I'm going to be able to go through this again and check some
Yeah.
locations. But thanks so much for this. And it was a really well done presentation. I think I found it really informative.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed putting it together, and I enjoyed seeing everyone. I wish I could have seen more of you in person, but feel free to contact if you have any questions.
Okay. Thanks.